One strait, 3 kilometers wide. Close it, and Qatar runs out of money in weeks. Iraq stops paying its army, and China's factories start rationing power. Today we're breaking down exactly which nations collapse first, and why. The Strait of Hormuz is 33 kilometers wide at its narrowest point. But the actual shipping lane, the corridor where tankers physically move, is just 3.2 kilometers wide in each direction, as defined by the IMO traffic separation scheme. One lane in, one lane out. Zero margin for error. Through that corridor, roughly 20 million barrels of oil move every single day. The IEA and EIA put the 2024 to 2025 average at that figure. That's approximately 1/5 of all the oil the world consumes, plus roughly 1/5 of global LNG trade, including virtually all exports from Qatar, the world's largest LNG exporter, which has no major overland pipelines to reach its buyers. Now here's the engineering problem. There are 2 bypass pipelines. The UAE's ADCOP handles up to 1.8 million barrels per day. Saudi Arabia's east-west petroline can redirect roughly another 1.5 to 2 million barrels per day in a crisis scenario. Combined, between 3.5 and 5.5 million barrels per day, assuming both run at full capacity, fully coordinated, with no infrastructure damage. Against 20 million barrels a day, that covers 27% of the flow at best. The other 73% has no alternative route. The IEA has explicitly noted these bypass systems have never been tested at crisis scale. That's the constraint. Every nation's vulnerability in this scenario flows directly from that number 73% of global Hormuz oil, with nowhere else to go. Now let's talk about the collapse itself. And to understand it, we need to think in tiers. Tier 1 is the most exposed category. These are the nations that become the crisis almost immediately. Qatar. Qatar is one of the wealthiest nations on earth, per capita. Enormous gas reserves, World Cup stadiums, a sovereign wealth fund estimated at around $450 to $500 billion. By any conventional measure, Qatar looks strong. But Qatar's entire economy runs on one product, liquefied natural gas. And virtually all of Qatar's LNG exports leave by tanker through the Arabian Gulf and its approaches. Qatar has no major overland export pipelines to large markets. Technically, tankers could attempt longer alternative maritime routes, but practically, the economics and logistics of those routes make them unviable at scale. When the Gulf approaches become unsafe, Qatar's export revenue stops completely. And unlike nations with diversified industries or large agricultural sectors, Qatar imports the vast majority of its food. When export revenue collapses, within weeks the ability to fund those imports, food, medicine, basic goods, begins to unravel. Qatar already experienced a version of this during the 2017 Gulf blockade, when Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and others cut off land and air routes. Qatar survived that with sea access intact. Remove the sea, and the calculus changes entirely. Iraq. Iraq exports roughly 3.3 million barrels of oil per day. According to Iraq's Ministry of Finance, and confirmed by the IMF, over 90% of Iraq's government revenue comes from oil, one of the highest dependencies of any nation on earth. And virtually all of those exports travel through the Gulf, straight through the Strait of Hormuz. Without that revenue, Iraq cannot pay its civil servants, military, healthcare workers, or infrastructure workers. Iraq has limited fiscal buffers. IMF and World Bank analysts have repeatedly warned that Iraq's budget model is highly vulnerable to any sustained interruption in oil sales. In a full closure scenario, analysts model severe fiscal stress, emerging within weeks to a few months, not years. A government that stops paying its army and its police is a government beginning to dissolve. Kuwait. Kuwait is one of the most oil export-dependent Gulf states. It exports approximately 2.1 million barrels per day, virtually all of it through Hormuz. Kuwait does hold a significant sovereign wealth fund, one of the world's oldest, which gives it a financial buffer Iraq and Qatar lack. That buffer delays the problem, it does not solve it. With oil exports halted, Kuwait loses the engine that funds its entire social contract: subsidized fuel, free healthcare, government salaries. Analysts assess that severe fiscal strain would emerge within weeks, even with sovereign wealth reserves, as government spending commitments would rapidly outpace available liquidity. These 3 nations, Qatar, Iraq, Kuwait, share a dangerous trait. They are incredibly wealthy because of Hormuz, which means they are incredibly fragile without it. Their wealth has not been reinvested into economic diversification at a sufficient scale. For all 3, the strait is the foundation of the social contract itself. Now we move to Tier 2. These are the industrial giants nations, with deep reserves, massive economies, and genuine strategic planning. They hold longer, but they enter a race against time with no viable finish line. China. China is the world's largest importer of crude oil. In 2024, China imported roughly 11 million barrels per day. Of that, approximately 42 to 54% came from Middle Eastern sources, and much of it passes through Hormuz. China has built up its strategic petroleum reserve aggressively. EIA analysts have estimated China's combined strategic and commercial oil stocks at somewhere in the range of 90 to 120 days of import needs, though China does not officially disclose these figures. So treat any specific number as an estimate, not a confirmed fact. What is clear is that China has more runway than most. But here's the calculation that matters. China's economy requires oil at a specific throughput to maintain its manufacturing output, supply chains, and export engine. Analysts model that when reserves begin depleting past a critical threshold, commonly placed somewhere in the 60 to 90 day range, factories begin rationing. When factories ration, they produce less. When they produce less, global supply chains that depend on Chinese manufacturing start fracturing. The timeline has no fixed number, it is a pressure curve. And by the time China's industrial sector is visibly rationing energy, the knock-on effects are already ricocheting through the global electronic supply chain, the auto parts market, and consumer goods manufacturing worldwide, not because the oil has run out, but because the anticipation of shortages triggers rationing behavior simultaneously across every supply chain on Earth. Japan. Japan's situation is almost poetic in its vulnerability. Japan imports roughly 95% of its oil from the Middle East, with approximately 70% of those shipments traveling through the Gulf and Hormuz approaches. Japan is one of the world's largest holders of strategic petroleum reserves, combining government stocks and industry-mandated storage. Japan's total coverage is estimated at well over 150 to 200 days of supply, making it significantly more resilient than most Asian economies. But Japan is an island nation with essentially no domestic fossil fuel production. Its manufacturing economy, vehicles, electronics, precision machinery, is energy-intensive by design. Even with large reserves, the moment supply stops flowing, the clock starts ticking. Japan's refineries and factories require a constant flow of crude, not just a stockpile to draw from. At some point, analysts model this, in the range of several months of sustained disruption, industrial rationing becomes unavoidable, regardless of reserve levels, simply because the logistics of replenishment from alternative sources cannot match the pace of consumption. South Korea. South Korea presents perhaps the most alarming Tier 2 case. It is one of the world's top 5 oil importers, with roughly 70% of its crude imports arriving from Middle Eastern sources. South Korea also hosts some of the world's largest shipyards and semiconductor fabrication plants, both of which are extraordinarily energy-intensive. South Korea's chips go into iPhones, into data centers, into medical equipment, into military systems worldwide. A sustained Hormuz closure fractures the global technology supply chain at its foundation. Before we get into the most underrated threat of all, quick word. These documentaries take dozens of hours to research, write, and produce. If you're finding this valuable and want to help support the channel, you can make a small donation through the first link in the description or the pinned comment. Completely optional, no pressure at all. But if you do, it genuinely helps keep videos like this coming. Alright, back to it. Because what comes next is the part most people completely miss. Here is the most dangerous mechanism in this entire scenario and the least reported. The Strait of Hormuz only needs to become unsafe. Closing it entirely is optional. It only needs to become unsafe. In 2019, a series of tanker incidents in the Gulf of Oman, widely attributed to regional actors at the time, left every ship moving through. The strait remained technically open. And yet, according to Anthony Gurney, CEO of Ardmore Shipping, speaking on CNBC, conflict zone insurance premiums for ships transiting the region had increased by 10 times within roughly 2 months of the attacks beginning. 10 times. Shipping companies are not charities. When insurance premiums spike dramatically, shipping companies do one of 3 things. They pass the cost to the buyer, reroute if any viable alternative exists, or stop sailing altogether until the risk reduces. In the Hormuz context, remember, there's no viable reroute for most of this cargo. The cost gets passed on, and oil prices move. When oil prices move by 20, 30, 40 US dollars per barrel, based on fear alone, not an actual shortage, every economy on Earth feels it. Fuel prices, shipping costs, and food costs rise because food is transported by vehicles running on fuel. Inflation accelerates. central banks respond aggressively, stock markets reprice. All of this from a strait that is technically, physically still open. This is what strategists call the uncertainty weapon. And Iran has explicitly referenced its ability to close the Strait of Hormuz during multiple geopolitical standoffs. In 2012, 2018, and 2020, each time, oil markets moved significantly, without a single tanker being physically stopped. The United States Fifth Fleet is permanently stationed in Bahrain, specifically to prevent a physical closure. The US, alongside allied naval forces, maintains constant patrol of the strait, and that presence is genuinely effective at preventing a prolonged, official closure. But it cannot prevent the insurance markets from reacting to a strike 15 kilometers away. It cannot prevent a shipping CEO in Athens from pulling his fleet out of a region where tankers are being targeted regardless of whether the lane is technically open. The infrastructure of global trade is built on predictability. Ports schedule arrivals weeks in advance. Refineries plan crude deliveries in 30-day cycles. Just-in-time manufacturing systems have almost no buffer inventory by design. The moment predictability collapses, even without a physical blockage, the entire system starts seizing up like an engine running without oil, which, in this case, is precisely what it would be doing. The Strait of Hormuz is the single most consequential piece of ocean on Earth, not because of its size, but because of what the world has built around it. 40 years of global energy infrastructure, supply chain design, and economic growth has been quietly organized around the assumption that this 3-kilometer corridor will always be open. That assumption has never truly been tested. The Tier 1 nations Qatar, Iraq, Kuwait are one sustained disruption away from a fiscal crisis they cannot manage alone. The Tier 2 nations China, Japan, South Korea are months away from industrial stress that would reshape global manufacturing. The exact timeline depends on reserves, rationing, and the pace of any alternative supply solution. But in every scenario analysts model, the direction is the same. And every other nation on Earth? They're downstream of all of it. One question remains. Every government in this analysis knows the exposure. So why has no real alternative been built? 3 reasons: pipelines, tanker shipping, strategic reserves. The result? The world has chosen a buffer over a solution, and that buffer has a limit. That's the story behind the story, and it's a lot more uncomfortable than the geography. That episode is coming, and if you made it this far, thank you. Genuinely, this kind of content takes a lot of time to research, verify, and produce properly. If you enjoyed it and want to help keep more of it coming, you can make a small donation through the first link in the description or the pinned comment. There's no obligation whatsoever, but every bit of support makes a real difference. Now, we just talked about a world that has no real backup for the Strait of Hormuz. But there's another strait, the Strait of Malacca, where one country is actually trying to build that backup. A land bridge designed to reroute global shipping entirely. Thailand is betting everything on it, and the story is just as wild as this one. That video is already up, it's linked right there on screen, and also in the description. Watch it next. I think you'll find it hits differently after what we just covered. If you want to understand how the world actually works, not how they tell you it works, subscribe and hit the bell, because we're just getting started. Watch next. Thailand's land bridge, the infrastructure that could bypass the Strait of Malacca,